This is part 2 of St Petersburg strolling on this very unique day. You'll see there's no traffic on the road here. There's some kind of conference or get-together with significant political figures here. I believe the foreign representatives of 4 different African nations are here. And this is Nevsky Prospect, Nevsky. So Nevsky Avenue. And of course you can see, I mean, there's 8 lanes there, right? 1, 2, yeah, there's 8 lanes. So this is a serious avenue, and it's all closed for at least a few hours as people go to and from. Let's continue on. So I'm on Nevsky and I'm walking westwards, and this of course is a very touristy kind of part of town, and a lot of these will be Russian tourists from other parts of the world, but other parts of Russia. A few other internationals as well, but obviously with the politics of the day, there's some division that was not existing a few years ago, so kind of limited in terms of who will come, but there are still Westerners here, and there's plenty of like Chinese and different Arabs and so forth as well holidaying here. It certainly is a very impressive city, as I said in the part 1 of this video. I mean, you'd clearly put this as your number 1 city to visit if you're after kind of city attractions, you know, good infrastructure of restaurants and so forth as well. It's a very livable city. We'll just go in here. A couple of landmarks here to check out on our city tour. So it's nice to see some green, because one downside of St Petersburg, and as I say, look, it's one of the better cities you're going to visit. Definitely one of the better cities you're going to visit in your life, but one downside would be the lack of greenery. It's friggin' cement jungle, I tell you what. It's an absolute cement jungle. This is, let me try and read that for you. Katerina in 1873. Well, let's continue our journey. So we're headed towards the area with the Hermitage Museum. Again, classic tourist trail. If you've been to St Petersburg, you'll know this. If you're going to come here, this is probably a good start for you guys on where to spend a day or two. Probably 2 or 3 actually, towards the end there, as you get off the mainland and onto a couple of different islands just past Hermitage Museum. There's certainly a lot to see around. There's no shortage of things that you want to see. I have to say there's a lot more tourist attractions here than there would be. Seeing a lot more city attractions here than you'd get in any Australian city, this is certain. Of course, Australian cities are not so old, whereas this is a very old city with a lot of history. Let's try and get on the right hand side here. Like a bit of social etiquette in my life. Got those kind of British style buses, the old classic double deckers there. So it's got that kind of public holiday feeling about it today, because the roads are, the traffic on this particular avenue is shut off. So yeah, I heard this saying a long time ago, that the most interesting thing in Russia are the Russians. So I want to talk a little bit about Russians, because I kind of feel for them a bit, just as normal day-to-day people at the moment. They're being actively... Oh, maybe we have to go under there. I think we do. It's a walk under. All right, let's go under there. They get a bit of a bad rap as people. Some of their maybe emotional volatility when abroad. I mean, not the only country like this, obviously. But even more emotionally volatile or outwardly volatile with their emotions. In Europe, they obviously, well, it depends where you are in Europe. Southern Europe's a bit different, but definitely Western Europe, as you would imagine it, into Scandinavia, including Britain, you would say that We're trained to control our emotions a lot more, whereas here they tend to let them out a bit. You'll see a few yelling and screaming matches. There was a good one yesterday. There were 6 or 7 girls on this bachelorette photo shoot thing just during the day, and man, they were screaming at each other. It was on. I was in the West. We're told not to do this, so there is some confusion, I think, between Russian and I guess classic parts of Europe in terms of culture. And definitely people might see Russians on holiday and hear a couple of them explode at a waitress or something, or be really what we would consider to be rude, and maybe create some negative stereotypes. But of course all stereotypes have some level of truth to them. That's how they come into existence, obviously. But yeah, it's a different way of interacting on some level. Let's get away from this dude with his backpack here. But it's kind of interesting because if that happens here, people let go of their annoyance straight away. So if someone getting in a disagreement with somebody, someone's frustrated, they might yell, but then it's kind of gone. This is what I find quite interesting, because it's easy for Westerners to judge and say, oh, they're so rude, whatever. They're so wild, but they kind of let go of it. Whereas Westerners, we get upset, we hold it in, and then we end up kind of having some, I guess, more passive-aggressive behaviour. Go home and write a Google review about something. Tell our friends, write it on Facebook about this really rude person they met today. Whereas here they'll just yell, say something, and then it's kind of forgotten. Now, I don't want to oversimplify it, but that's one angle of it, of these differences in behaviour. Of course, it probably reflects other deeper cultural aspects as well, right? Obviously. But I thought I'd just make that observation. For example, there was a lady who was dressed quite well, kind of maybe even in her 40s, I don't know, 30s or 40s. She was strutting along, dressed in a very classic kind of Russian, Soviet kind of style, very kind of hyper feminine kind of appearance. And these 3 workers were just sitting on a little, like this kind of thing here. And the lady walked past, and I think 1 or 2 of them said something to her, just, whatever. She's beautiful, she's sexy, something else, maybe a bit more crass. And she stopped, and she went back to them, and she gave them the biggest telling off. It was quite amusing. I just kind of stood there and observed what was going on, and then yelled at them, pointed the finger at them for maybe 10 seconds, and then started to walk off. And then one of the meds said something again, and then she came back again for round 2, another 10 seconds of blasting. And it's like, that's kind of good because it's done now. It's not such a big deal. They just said something, whatever, quote unquote rude, but really it's just words. And she didn't like it, so she told them, and then it's done. You know what I mean? There's no going online, there's no whatever, it's just sorted out between people. Now, of course, some situations may end up maybe with fights and stuff, but yeah, the stories I've heard about people throwing punches here are often not kind of all in brawls or really savage. It's just maybe throw one punch out of frustration or something. This is the stories I've heard. I haven't witnessed any of this stuff. So we'll be getting, I reckon, at least almost 3/4 of the way to Hermitage Museum. I'm including part A of this walking video, of course. But yeah, there's a bit of a disconnect between Soviet style, old Sovietsy style culture and interactions and mentality. Of course, another one is small talk. They don't really do the small talk here. In the West, we would think that everything's awkward if you're not talking or whatever. Here, it's just like, why are you talking if it's no point talking? It's kind of classic mentality, and even jokes. Like here, it's kind of more of a drier, sarcastic kind of humour. Vis-a-vis maybe Western humour. So there's kind of differences, and it's interesting how so much of who and what we are is cultural and learned, and then once you have a culture, it's bloody stubborn. You know, it's hard to change a culture. I mean, look now, we're undergoing what might be the biggest global cultural engineering process we've ever gone through. And of course, I'm including things like Christianity and Islam in that equation, but the current one it seems to be coming from the US. Seems to be. It's kind of engineering, I guess, liberalism alongside, this is what I'm talking about, liberalism alongside, I guess, the current strain of feminism and a few other kind of social justice, as they're termed, groups, these kind of political lobby groups, or LGBT, etc. Would be another one of those. And this is a very ambitious and very aggressive global re-engineering. But if you take out this kind of deliberate cultural takeover, if you will, cultures are bloody stubborn. People keep each other in line. Culture stays the same. It's very hard to change a culture. All right, I have been here before. So I tell you, we're only a few minutes from the end of this street. We've got some interesting buildings coming up. We've got one here on the left, if I recall correctly. In fact, I may even just cross here very quickly. There's a bit more on this side, and this leads on to some more interesting areas. Look over here, it's a beautiful building, this one, my goodness. This is like some kind of, I think it's a classic retail shop here, like one with some kind of history in it. So I'm trying to keep you guys zoomed in a bit because I think it's interesting to see people up close, what they're doing, what they're wearing, how they're vibing. I'll just slow down a bit. I'm in a habit here of kind of pushing in and kind of barging through and being a bit more on the slightly aggressive side on the footpath. So I'll just slow down a bit, break that habit just for you guys. And I do that primarily because I don't want to get trodden on myself. It's a big city with lots of tourists, and people are constantly going slowly and bumping into each other and holding each other up, whatever. So typically when I'm walking, I'd rather get through faster. So there's the what I was talking about just before. Really built to last. It's funny when I tease the Belarusians about their Soviet apartment blocks, which of course are of varying generations and varying quality, of course. But some of them, especially from around the 60s into 70s, some of those were amongst the ugliest buildings to ever be made. And they're really upsetting. They'd make the baby cry, honestly, some of these buildings. They're so ugly. These old Soviet buildings. And then there's a generation, there's obviously many generations, but there was a generation of, they're supposed to be temporary at the time, of course. And, it's all well if people haven't really got much housing and you build a whole lot of apartments, well, anything's good, right? But certainly there wasn't an eye for detail. There wasn't an eye for design. It was all very practical. All very practical. And of course, like most things communist, they kind of forget that we're humans. And indeed, the whole principle of communism is that we're all stupid, really. And we need to be told what to do and what have you. I don't want to oversimplify, but money's the only important thing. If we value something other than money, there's something wrong with us. We need to be shown that money is the most important thing and blah, blah, blah. Of course, a cynical view, but it's consistent with what the behaviour of an ideology of communism. You can also spin it a positive way if you want to, but I think we have enough history on this kind of activity where we can go a bit further than just robotically repeating the ideology. I remember in university I was told all this Marxist ideology. I was taught it all as if it was somehow fact, and then it's like, hang on a minute, we have facts. Why haven't we spoken about these? And yeah, you could do it in a very objective term. Obviously, I've just sledged communism a little bit, but yeah, there's positives about it as well. And you know, I'm sure, well, assuming they didn't roll the tanks in and kill you, which is what they did, right? If you had any resistance, they just bang. You're trying to keep your property, bang. Trying to keep your business, bang. Like, might rape a few of you women on the way through as well. Pretty savage, but once they rolled in and started building, there's probably a lot of positives in the first decade or two of communist life. They create some good infrastructure, including housing, good metro systems, start building universities and hospitals. Like, I imagine the early days of communism could be really billed as something very positive and interesting and exciting. What do you reckon? Should we go for this or not? Let's go. Let's get across. We'll get halfway anyway. And stop. So yeah, I reckon if you were in a very poor country and people were really struggling and suddenly got a nice apartment with heating, you've come off the land, because a lot of those old houses, pre-communist in this part of the world, they didn't have like gas heating like they have now. I mean, I've been in a few of these and they had like a little furnace in every room. And you'd have to have your year's worth of wood, and you'd have to burn the wood inside the furnace inside every room to keep the room warm. So I imagine a nice little apartment with centralised gas and whatever suddenly given to you in this kind of industrialisation process would have been bloody good. So I can see that first generation of communism could have actually, maybe been pretty good times. But of course, as the problems leak through the society, people stop doing anything, the massive abuses of power that must come with so much centralized power. Could you imagine a handful of people controlling every institution? Like, what could go wrong? Unaccountable, totally unaccountable. Well, to an extent. I mean, it has to fall apart eventually, but controlling media, controlling curriculum, controlling everything. I mean, just this kind of it's remarkable. Self-assigned cultural engineers, economic engineers. I mean, it's all happened, obviously, but it's bloody hard to imagine that it did, really. And it happened so quickly, right? Like, the Communist Manifesto, I could be wrong here, but I think that it was, here's Stolovaya, if you don't know, these are effectively local. I think it actually translates to dining room, I'm pretty sure, Stolovaya. You can see that if you can't read Russian, you got salads, so from 55 rubles, 90 rubles is $1. Soup, borscht, which is a soup, cutlets, which is like a chicken kind of sausage thing, shashlik, which is more like proper chicken, riba, fish, garniri, I don't know what this is. Syrniki is like a tvarog, it's what do you call it, like cottage cheese, fried cottage cheese. I think the last two you can probably read because they're direct translations from English, or very similar. It's actually funny filming in a tourist area, because if you film in a normal area, man, people jump in all the time. People love to just do a wave in front of the camera, or like walk behind you and wave or something. Like, it's incredibly common. Whereas when you're in a tourist area, no one does it because everyone has a camera out, so it's not very interesting. It's kind of funny. Right, let's get across here. We're getting to the heat, the hot spot now. This is where things get really interesting. There's a lot of landmarks around here. But just on the communist thing, to try and give some balance to it, because I don't want to feel like I'm just sledging it, because as I say, there are definitely some positives. But yeah, centralising that much power into a small number of hands, it's a bit of a worry, isn't it? It's hard to imagine that ever turning out well. It's so easy to be corrupted and, government officials to line their own pockets. It's kind of how it seemed to have worked in every instance. But China's a funny one because it's still going. Well, there's a few of them still going, but in terms of meaningful powers around the world, because North Korea is probably the most purest form of it still going, but they're just kind of like in their own little bubble there. Well, not entirely in their own little bubble there, but you know, not changing. Whereas China's embraced the American capital and the American consumer and gotten very rich in the process. But you notice in China, it's only a small number of people getting rich, right? Like, yeah, they've lifted quite a lot out of poverty. There's been some improvement at the bottom, but when you look at the data, the inequality data, if you know economics, the Lorenz curve, just plotted around the Gini coefficient, you can just see how much inequality has risen there. And that really all that's happening is all this wealth that's being created is just going straight to the party members. And they tell their people that, you know, let a few get rich first. That's their motto. And this is classic communism, actually. That was Marx's vision, that you must have a rich capitalist society first, and you create the wealth first, and then you can redistribute it later. That was the idea of it. So here, of course, they try to generate the wealth in Russia, or in the Soviet Union. They try to generate the wealth rather than redistribute it. Whereas China now is trying to do the other way around. And of course, you know, you'd have a lot of rights to be fairly cynical about this, wouldn't you? Now this is interesting to walk down here. In fact, let's walk down here because this is a great archway. Some famous monuments around it. So we'll head down here and then it breaks into the, let's see what they're watching here. So yeah, in terms of China, it may be that the uniform nature of the Communist Party may actually protect its civilization over the long term. Which is very interesting to think about. Whereas America, maybe there's too many people tugging at the American power cords and fighting each other. Like, obviously now there's this culture war. Well, it's originating in the US and it's very intense in the US, but it's obviously coming in everywhere. But in the US, it really seems to be the OG place for culture war. By culture war, I mean, I guess, just existing status quo culture and some watered down Christianity on some level, feminist / Christianity, kind of a hybrid system there, and the incoming liberalism, globalism, postmodernism, these things kind of coming in, and this big fight for institutions and fight for the culture. It's like a war, but without the tanks. It's like the new kind of war. Rather than rolling their tanks and taking them over, you just take over their minds. And build it in such a way where they want to be taken over. It's a fascinating era that we're in, honestly. I hope that history reflects it somewhat accurately. I mean, it's unlikely. Of course, the winner writes the history books, right? So I'm sure that most of what we think we know about history is incredibly tainted by the politics of the authors. I tell you what, this kind of basic IG culture here, Instagram culture, there's actually not as much of it here as I thought there would be compared to Belarus. I mean, Instagram and photos of, especially the girls, photos of themselves is deeply embedded in the culture. Here in St Petersburg, at least, it's not so much actually, which again I'm kind of surprised about. This is the Hermitage Museum here. So yeah, anyway, just on what I was saying, the Chinese communist system may actually outlast the American capitalist system because it forces homogeneity. And they're not all bad either, you know, like, they're not all bad. I mean, if you just stay away from the government, they stay away from you, you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of how it works. You'd hope that they would redistribute money and income and stuff when they figure they're rich enough, but I think you'd be pretty naive to think they would. There's no evidence of that in history. As communist governments mature, they tend to just keep more and more for themselves, right? So it's difficult to see that pattern breaking. Very difficult to see that pattern breaking in any meaningful way, but who knows? We can remain positive and optimistic about the future, but I mean, China's got its own problems like everyone else does, and the biggest one is they're not having any kids. this needs to be addressed. But of course, this is happening everywhere and no government wants to talk about it. They're just like, oh yeah, let's give incentives. Let's give financial incentives to have children. It's like, well, that doesn't work. It works for about 5 minutes. You know what I mean? It can help a little bit at the margin. You know, it might boost your fertility rate from 1.5 kids per woman to 1.57 or something. But in reality, you know, having kids and wanting to have kids and enjoying this whole process, and embracing the whole process is a cultural thing. And definitely part of the culture wars. If you look at the kind of, the anti-culture side or the new culture side, whatever you want to call it, postmodern, globalist kind of side, they're certainly very much about not having children. It seems that most of their agenda is focused around, well, they don't say it like this, obviously, they don't say it this way. Because if you start saying, don't have kids, they're bad, I mean, people are going to resist that, but the way they're setting up the culture, it seems very little incentive for anyone ever to have children again. And you could make the argument there's too many people on the planet. I'm not sure how you'd calculate that, if it's true or if it's not true. I've got no idea. Maybe we could fit another 20 billion, who knows? Maybe not. But obviously, any number you pick is just going to be arbitrary, right? Who knows? But nonetheless, yeah, China's got its own demographic implosion coming. And this is a big problem when you look at communist ideology. Yeah, as I say, money's first, right? Money's the only thing that really matters. So of course no one has any kids. Now you can push, and this is what they do in communist governments. I've heard this from a lot of people who've grown up in them, that they do try and push the idea of family unit. They try and push the idea of being nice to fellow citizens as well. This is common, and still it's common in China. The Chinese government still push that idea of be kind to each other in their curriculum. But in reality, you can say it all you want, but it needs to be embedded more deeply than just rehearsing it. And look, they are quite civil with each other for the most part, the Chinese. There is a strong camaraderie there, but the party's smart. The party also tells them not to trust each other and not to trust strangers, right? But to be nice to each other. It's kind of interesting. So you got that surface level functionality without people getting any ideas and trying to overthrow the party, right? Anyway, I'm kind of all over the place at the moment in terms of topics. I might just take you guys down to the end here. But yeah, it may be that in terms of going back to the core idea, the communist idea, it may be that the Chinese Communist Party outlasts American capitalism because of that unity. You know, because of that unity, they're all together, whether they like it or not. But look, most Chinese people I know don't care too much about the government. It's like, yeah, they're fine, they're doing a good job, everything's stable. And if you go back pre-communist era in China, God, there was bloodshed for almost a century, right? So many internal wars, and I mean, this is why, or major reason why you got so many Chinese throughout surrounding countries, particularly Malaysia. Of course, they broke off and made their own ethnic state of Singapore, and a lot in Indonesia as well. Chinese just fleeing this constant war machine, these constant wars, shall I say. So they do give stability, and of course Chinese, they certainly have shown over the centuries to have a fondness for money, and I guess stability enables them to make that money. They've got the basics covered. They can focus on working and making money, although you got this concept of lying down, which you may have heard. And they're actually changing the curriculum. About 3 years ago, they changed the curriculum to make it that students study less. They're realizing that you can't just work people to death, and I certainly know a number of Chinese that want to leave China only because of the working hours. 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. They're like, nah, fuck that. I'll live in Australia for 5 days a week and 8 hours a day. And I've heard a number of Chinese people say this. So they're obviously, the government's realizing they're going to start losing people, and they can't keep slave driving, so they've got to get a bit of Instagram action. So yeah, the government's realizing that they're going to have to make some changes, and as I say, they've kind of got some incentive to look after the civilization on some level. Again, not perfectly so, but on some level. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in a few decades, but anyway, got onto this because, of course, we are in the Russian Federation, which was the driver of the Soviet Union. Check out a little bit of Savior of the Blood. That's the oh, it's in English as well, sorry. I'm getting a bit fatigued. It's been half an hour on this video and 20 minutes on the last one. This is a monument on the other side here. I'll just get to the other side here, about a minute away, and show you, because there's about 4 sizable monuments all near each other. This lady's got some game. What's she up to? Something. Good thing is, with my camera, they probably leave me alone. These people who are trying to make a buck. Fair enough. Bit of hustle. Buy that costume and make yourself a job. Can't imagine what it would happen to these people during COVID time. Anything linked to tourism, oh my goodness. They would have been hungry. Alright, so this is a massive river coming up here, and you can see a number of the tourist sites, prominent tourist sites from here. It's the Avushka trying to choose what ice cream she wants. She's really stressing out. So you can continue on there. There's a number of significant monuments up there. I'll call it quits for now. We've had a good walk around. I hope you've enjoyed the views from St Petersburg.